to hear Michael Lee Pope talk about politics in Virginia and how they impacted on the Northern Virginia region. So let me tell you a little bit about him. He is an award-winning journalist. He lives in Old Town, but we won't hold that against him. He's reported for the Alexandria Gazette Packet, WAMU, the New York Daily News, the Tallahassee Democrat. He's a native of Georgia, but he grew up in a little bit further north in Durham, North Carolina, and he graduated from high school in Florida. Again, we won't hold that against you. He says, please hold it against him. No. He has a master's degree in American Studies from Florida State University, and he has 5 books, all of which are for sale here tonight. And he will be happy to sign them for me. Thank you so much for doing this for us.
Thank you.
Please welcome Michael Lee Pope.
All right, I am a radio person, so I like microphones. Can everybody hear me? So I got the Zoom people. Can the Zoom people hear me? I'm sorry, what was that? I'm too loud?
We can hear you.
Okay. I'm often told.
Zoom can hear you well.
All right. This great institution came with something that I'm not exactly sure why it's here. But I got this bell. I'm not exactly sure how I'm going to use this bell, but how can I pass it up? Thank you so much for coming out tonight. I really appreciate you taking the time to learn about my new book, The Byrd Machine in Virginia, The Rise and Fall of the Conservative Political Organization. So I wanted to take a few moments to talk about why I wrote this book, why it exists. And I should have figured this out beforehand. Is this how I change the slides? That doesn't seem to have worked. But you know, I could probably hit this screen.
Maybe.
Why the arrow key didn't work?
Right. Let's see. No more. Okay, to this.
Please hold on.
Technical issues. Sorry.
So the reason why I wrote, oh, there you go. How did you do that?
That's a little awkward. So let me see what I can figure out here.
There might be a shortcut. That seems to have worked. Yeah, you're good. All right.
Now the arrow keys work.
Thank you so much. Okay. IT. Technology is great until it's no longer great, and then it's a pain. So yeah, I wanted to tell you a little bit about why I wrote this book and why it came about. So almost 20 years ago, I moved to Virginia and I started asking questions about how stuff works. So it didn't take me long to hear about the nefarious influence of something called the Byrd machine. And I would hear about this over and over again. It was always something that was lurking in the background as an explanation for why things work the way that they do. So Virginia has only 3 statewide elected officials. That's a legacy of the Byrd machine. Virginia has a long history of shortchanging public education, the Byrd machine. Virginia is a place where unions just don't have the same kind of power that they do in other states, the Byrd machine. And then there's systemic racism, right? That's a legacy of the Byrd machine. Now, Virginia has all of these different parts of the Byrd machine that are legacies, right? So perhaps the most notorious legacy of the Byrd machine is something called massive resistance, right? Closing public schools rather than put Black children and white children in the same classroom. So all these things are legacies of the Byrd machine, and it's an ongoing legacy. So the Byrd machine may have fallen apart in the late 1960s, but in many ways, the system is still with us, like a zombie machine kind of aimlessly wandering around. So I wanted to start by taking a look at political machines. So this is an 1871 cartoon called The Brains by Thomas Nast. It's about Boss Tweed and the Tammany Hall political machine in New York City, which is probably the most famous political machine in American history. So if you know anything about political machines, you probably know something about this one. But it's not the only one. There's also James Pendergast in Kansas City, James Michael Curley in Boston. So these were all big city political machines. Things worked a bit differently in the South, though, where the good old boy networks of small town Dixie used a combination of patronage and electioneering to maintain power. So this is where the Byrd machine defied the odds, staying in power way longer than any of the other political machines, outlasting Boss Crump in Tennessee and even Huey Kingfish Long in Louisiana. So from his perch as chairman of the Senate Finance Committee in Washington, D.C., Senator Harry Byrd controlled Virginia politics with a kind of animal instinct that prevented anyone from getting anywhere close to the reins of power. As Time magazine noted in 1958, quote, "The Byrd machine is an oligarchy composed of the few chosen by the few to make decisions for the many." The origin of the Byrd machine is often traced to the day that this guy, Harry Byrd, became chairman of the Democratic Party of Virginia in 1922, so 100 years ago. That's a position he used to carefully oversee the flow of money and power. So the Byrd machine was a statewide operation, but it operated as a kind of network of courthouse rings. Sheriffs, judges, clerks of court, right? They all conspired to hold power by using the mechanics of elections to control outcomes. The New York Times explained it this way in 1949, quote, "It has become as much a fixture in the comfortable cloistered life of the people of this state as, say, their faith in the Confederacy, or their addiction to buttermilk biscuits, or Smithfield ham." This is the New York Times, by the way. To relate Senator Byrd to this palpable monolith is a little like debating the divine origin of the scriptures. You know the answer, but just try to prove it. So this is the New York Times view of Virginia in 1949. Addiction to buttermilk biscuits and Smithfield ham and the Confederacy, right? Probably we might want to reevaluate that for our modern audiences. But the center of the center of power. The center of power for the Byrd machine was this place, the courthouse. So this is your local courthouse in Arlington. At the time, it's actually, this building is no longer around. But this is where the organization functionaries kept the engine humming along, and election after election. County seats across Southside Virginia, up and down the Shenandoah Valley to the Eastern Shore, and even here in Arlington at that courthouse. All these places competed with each other to see who could provide the most lopsided victory for the machine candidate. The old Confederate statue guarding the courthouse, not this courthouse, but most of them, was a not so subtle hint that retrograde forces were at work. Few people held as much power or had as much influence as the local clerk of court, who was welcomed in the back room of the senator's Washington office and in the hotel suites of his lieutenants in Richmond. Historian Harv Wilkinson put it this way, quote, "There will always be a certain mystique surrounding the manner in which the organization picked its candidates for governor. From the informal give and take to the courthouse preferences, the senator's own wishes, and the choices of the senator's closest advisors, a preferred candidate usually emerged and proceeded to an almost certain victory in the forthcoming Democratic primary and in the general election." So courthouse clerks organized local elections for the organization candidates, aided by the sheriff and the Commonwealth's attorney. Members of the local board of supervisors worked as the public face of the campaign team, as did the delegation to the General Assembly. Behind the scenes, the chief judge of the circuit court would encourage support from the organization candidate by offering to use his power to appoint key positions in the jurisdiction, patronage. The bread and butter of any political machine is patronage. And in the Byrd machine, it flowed through the courthouse during election season as judges named members of everything from your local electoral board to the school board, to the welfare board, to the board of reassessors. They were all appointed by the chief judge. Wilkinson explained it this way, quote, "Candidate appearances also featured a handshaking tour near the courthouse, followed by impassioned eloquence before a small but sympathetic courtroom crowd. Large fans hanging from the high ceilings to break the heat of a July afternoon, light green courtroom walls broken only by the faded pictures of county fathers and former circuit court judges. Harry Byrd grimly warning a grasping federal government. Such was the classic snapshot, which would soon take its place beside the New England town meeting and the presidential whistle stop in the gallery of fond political memories." It's hard to look at them. So how did all this happen? How did we get this machine that ran Virginia politics for 50 years? In order to answer that question, we need to go way back to the Civil War and meet this guy, former Confederate General William Mahone. After the Civil War, he transformed himself into a railroad executive and then ultimately a United States senator who created Virginia's first political machine. So the Byrd machine was not the first political machine. It was not the second political machine. It was actually the third political machine. So we have to learn about this guy first. William Mahone, his meteoric rise to power was matched only by his breakneck fall from grace. Mahone was so exacting with his wardrobe that his tailor once said he would rather make dresses for 8 women than 1 suit for this guy. And if actually you look at this photo, you can tell he was very exacting with his wardrobe here. He spoke with a squeaky voice and stood at 5'6", weighing in at about 100 pounds, soaking wet. But don't let that fool you. He ran a cutthroat operation that seized power after Reconstruction and kept its steely grip on Virginia politics for as long as possible. Historian C. Van Woodward put it this way, quote, "In the whole gallery of Southern figures of this generation, he stands out as one of the boldest and most enigmatical. Mahone was a self-made man, not to the manner born, yet possessed of an imperviousness of will and manner and an overweening confidence in his own destiny." So William Mahone, like, not only did he make an impact in politics, he also left a lasting impression on Virginia's place names. His wife was a big fan of the novel Ivanhoe. And so several place names along the Norfolk to Petersburg Railroad line reflect names that bear her taste in literature. This is the Waverly train station. It's one of the many places in Virginia that still bear the memory of Mrs. Mahone and her love of place names inspired by Ivanhoe. Other place names we can thank for Mrs. Mahone include Wakefield, Windsor, and Ivor. At the end of the line, infamously, there was an argument between the two Mahones, which led to a very curious name. Apparently, they got into an argument. And so now Virginia, even today, has a place called Disputania. It's a true story. Mahone is a man of contradictions, hero of the lost cause who helped Black people get elected to the General Assembly, railroad tycoon who became the hero of the working man, enemy of the establishment who became a political boss. His machine ended the poll tax, abolished the whipping post, boosted funding for asylums, forced railroads to bear a larger share of the tax burden, and repudiated about 1/3 of Virginia's debt. It increased the appropriation for public education by about 50% and opened scores of new schools across Virginia. So that was a progressive legacy here. It was also a cutthroat and ruthless political operation. He demanded office holders contribute a fixed percentage of their salaries to the political party that he was a part of, the Readjuster Party. 5% if you were a state employee, and only 2% if you were a federal employee. So you got a break if you were a federal employee, but 5% of your salary had to go to this guy and his party. Businessmen who scored state contracts were expected to share the wealth and help finance party activities. The readjusters who held office were required to sign pledges agreeing to support specific bills and specific candidates approved by the caucus. Now, his political machine fell apart after the Danville riot, which prompted a wave of white supremacy and ultimately the Jim Crow Constitution that limited who could vote and consolidated power in wealthy white elites who hated Mahone and his machine. That's when new rules around voting swept this man into power. Thomas Staples Martin. This is the second political machine. This guy is a lawyer from Scottsville who was counselor for the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad. He was, like as I said, had the second political organization in Virginia, which was largely created as a reaction to the Mahone machine. The source of his power was railroad money. Railroad executive, big railroad money, that's what he used to grease the wheels of his political machine. So this was an era with concerns about election integrity. Between 1874 and 1900, no fewer than 20 congressional elections had been officially contested. So that led to a constitutional convention to write new rules. Progressives were clamoring for what they conceived of as election reform, tightening the rules to prevent against what they believed was voter fraud. So the era of black elected officials in Virginia was about to come to a close. Enter this guy, Senator Carter Glass. Like many people of the era, Carter Glass was a newspaper man. He left school early to become a reporter for the Lynchburg News, and within a few years, he owned the newspaper. When delegates to the Constitutional Convention, the Virginia Constitutional Convention, met in 1901 to craft a new system of voting, Carter Glass was there with a plan to purify politics. And when he said the word purity, it meant white supremacy. Now, it's disturbing how freely people from this era throw around racial slurs. But it's really important for us to understand the language that was acceptable at that time. And so if you look at the official record of the convention, it includes this quote from Carter Glass. This is a famous quote, "The plan of popular suffrage will eliminate the darky as a political factor in this state in less than 5 years." So Carter Glass had this plan, and basically he was right. The new Constitution in 1901 dramatically reduced the number of voters. If you take a look at the number of voters that voted in the 1905 election, which is after the Constitution, and compare it to the previous one, the 1901 election, you will see a significant decline in the number of people who voted, who were able to vote. So in 1901, before the change, there was a progressive governor, Andrew Jackson Montague. He was elected. And then the next election cycle, there were new rules in place. About 35% fewer voters actually were part of that election. And the machine candidate, Claude Swanson, was elected in 1905. Swanson was part of the Martin machine. So the progressives, there's an irony here. The progressives were the one who were pushing for election reform. They thought it as like a good government movement to end what they thought, was election fraud. But they ended up handing the keys to the kingdom to the political machine, whose leaders, ironically, were reluctant to change the existing system. They knew how to work the existing system, so they wanted to keep it where it was. Thank you very much. But since they got a new system, as it turns out, they benefited tremendously from the new system. Historian With Holt explains it this way, quote, "The reform of the electorate boomeranged on the reformers. It reduced the electorate by 1/2, removing the voting power at the bottom, which probably would have supported reform." So a bit more about the man at the center of this second political machine, Thomas Staples Martin. During World War I, Senator Martin oversaw the greatest expenditure of revenue ever made by the government of the United States at that time. World War I. So the strain of that responsibility took a toll, and Martin's health may have been one of the casualties of World War I. So when Republicans seized control of the Senate in March 1919, Martin became minority leader. 8 months later, he died in Charlottesville, and the future of the machine was in doubt. Uh-oh, I don't want to sign out. Obviously a fan of the machine here. The machine is a fan of the machine.
Okay, this is not good. Sorry about this. For some reason, Zoom is misbehaving. Kathy, can you hear me? Yeah.
Delegate Mark Sickles is not part of the political machine.
The slide will not
Yeah.
advance.
Yeah, but he's working on it.
Okay. Never had this happen.
No.
We
Can you
apologize.
see-
I apologize. He is going to sign back in and see if that will fix the problem.
Okay, if you want to get technical about it, all right. We have a budget amendments.
I can hear you. To those in Zoom, we are trying to, for some reason, keeps getting kicked off. So we're hoping that we got it corrected. This has not happened, but as we said at the beginning, technology is only as good as when it works.
Kathy, it should be
Yeah.
working now.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. All right. I was just about to get some news out of Mark Sickles, but maybe that's one. All right. Where the heck was I? The Thomas Staples Martin, World War I took his toll. He died. There in the Richmond Times Dispatch, the obituary for Thomas Staples Martin said this, quote, "For more than 20 years, this Virginian was a master of party politics in the state. He himself never suffered defeat as a candidate, and few of the men he nominated for office and behind him whom he threw his full support were rejected at the polls." So pretty impressive record here from Thomas Staples Martin. Not a household name today. In fact, this is the portrait that used to be in the Capitol. It was removed. Eileen Fillercorn actually took out this portrait of Thomas Staples Martin and replaced him with a landscape. His death in 1919 left a vacuum, and it was a vacuum that was filled by a young guy named Harry Byrd. So Harry Byrd was born with a silver spoon in his mouth, although it was a tarnished antique. His family could trace its history all the way back to the Blue Bloods of the 17th century, a time when William Byrd arrived on the banks of the James River and fought in Bacon's Rebellion. His maternal grandmother was a daughter of a U.S. senator and ambassador to England. So by the time a young Harry Byrd was born in the summer of 1887, Virginia was in a state of genteel poverty. Historian Alden Hatch put it this way, quote, "Paint was peeling off the noble Corinthian columns of the great mansions, roofs were leaky or obviously patched, and every man over 30 could remember the time when federal troops, the carpetbaggers, were going hungry because of devastated fields and stolen cattle, the wreckage of the economy." So after Harry Byrd's father was elected Speaker of the House of Delegates, a young Harry Byrd decided to take charge of the family business, the family newspaper, which was struggling to make ends meet. So when a young Harry Byrd took control of the Winchester Evening Star, it was in very sorry shape. Advertisers were notoriously late paying for their spots in the paper, and many skipped out altogether. By the time the debt to the Antietam Paper Company had grown beyond $2,500, the company refused to ship any more paper on credit. So Harry Byrd had a crazy idea to save the newspaper. Pay as you go. Here was the plan. He would drive all the way to the Antietam Paper Company in Maryland every single day and buy one roll of paper. That's all he could afford, the one roll of paper. And then the next order of business was driving back to Winchester and tracking down all those derelict businessmen who weren't paying their bills and getting the money. And then the next day he would do it again. If the Winchester Star went out of business, he argued, readers in Winchester would have only one other advertising option, the news item. Nobody wanted to advertise in the news item, right? That was the rival newspaper owned by George Norton, and it would have a monopoly on all those unpaid bills if there was no Winchester Star around. This was the argument he was making. So the newspaper business was not really the source of financial success. The real apple of his eye was apples. The apple business. Okay, so as a 19-year-old, Byrd started working to harvest the apple orchards in Winchester. So during apple season, he lived in a truck that was like a house on wheels, a vehicle that also carried the spray rig and all the tools. By 1911, he was able to save up enough capital to buy a plot of land on Hawthorne Drive in Winchester for an orchard of his own. Byrd grew 16 different types of apples. Think about that for a second. 16 different types of apples. I found this fascinating. Some of these you may have heard of, but some of these are probably long gone. Here are just a few of the varieties that he grew. Ben Davies, Albemarle Pippins, Grimes Goldens, Stamens, Yorkshires, Wine Snaps, Wealthies, Smokehouses. So we talked about the newspaper business. We talked about the apple business. Byrd was actually one of the largest apple growers on the planet at one point. But there's another very important thing to know about Harry Byrd, is that he became president of something called the Valley Turnpike Company. By the 1920s, the rise in automobiles was putting new pressure on an old problem, the deplorable state of Virginia's roads. Before the Civil War, Virginia borrowed heavily to build roads and turnpikes. After the war, that debt was paid at face value, and road building became a county problem, a local problem. But then the rise of the automobile created a new set of political momentum. A young state senator, Harry Byrd, led a campaign to force a new system of financing road construction, pay as you go. So he grafted what he learned in the newspaper business into politics in the state Senate to oppose the people who wanted to do debt financing. So he has a pay-as-you-go mentality here. So in the early 1920s, many senators were hopeful that they could persuade voters in a statewide referendum to approve a plan of debt financing for Virginia highways. Byrd said, "Over my dead body, you're going to do that," and led the forces against debt spending. So there was a statewide referendum. All the voters had to choose one way or the other. Byrd made a name for himself politically by having a pay-as-you-go system, opposing debt financing. Historian Stanley Willis put it this way, quote, "Here's an example of the methods of the new organization. Increasingly, there would be less room for it less room in it for those who chose to follow paths even slightly inimical to the dominant faction. Advocates for the referendum, the borrowing referendum, were hopeful that foul weather on the day of the referendum would help their cause. But the anti-bond, anti-debt financing forces flooded the ballot box. Although few cities approved the idea of borrowing money to improve roads, voters up and down the Shenandoah Valley rejected the idea. So too did rural farming communities in Southside and Central Virginia. Harry Byrd marshaled his forces into a statewide operation, and he earned a reputation for himself as a political leader who had an iron fist concealed underneath a velvet glove. As Stanley Willis notes, quote, "With this victory, the Byrd era publicly began." So Harry Byrd was elected governor in 1925 at the age of 38. This is very young, actually, for a governor to be elected at 38. He famously refused to wear a silk hat to the inauguration to avoid being called what one voter said was Silk Hat Harry. He didn't want to be Silk Hat Harry, so he didn't wear the silk hat. His most significant accomplishment during his term as governor was the so-called short ballot. This is very important. Eliminating the election of all the cabinet officials and making them all appointments. So if you think about this for a second, in other states, voters elect the person that oversees elections. We don't do that in Virginia. In other states, they elect the person who oversees the education system. We don't do that in Virginia. The governor has the power to appoint all those people. Voters don't appoint them, the governor appoints them. That's the short ballot. The most significant thing that happened when he was in the governor's mansion. So paired with voter suppression from that old Jim Crow Constitution we just talked about, the Byrd and his organization now had a recipe for a durable machine that could last well into the 20th century, and perhaps even in some ways beyond. After his term as governor, Byrd is appointed to fill a vacancy in the United States Senate when Franklin Roosevelt appointed Senator Claude Swanson as Secretary of the Navy. So from his new perch in the Russell Senate office building, Senator Harry Byrd, U.S. Senator Harry Byrd, oversaw the operation of the political machine that he put in place as governor back in the 1920s. During its time in power, the Byrd machine faced a labor crisis. They faced opposition from young war vets and ultimately self-destructed over the civil rights movement. So first, the labor crisis. This is the Virginia Electric and Power Company, known at the time as VEPCO. This is now what's known as Dominion Energy, same company. Employees here decided that they wanted better working conditions and better pay, so they started organizing for a strike. But then they came across this guy, Governor Bill Tuck, the Byrd machine governor from the time period, who wanted to thwart the power of the unions. The 235-pound Bill Tuck described Democratic national leadership as political rapscallions. He didn't like the Democratic Party very much, leadership of the Democratic Party. He castigated opponents as Washington wastrels and Union churls. He railed against Judas-like betrayals and outbursts of perfidy. He once declared that an organization opponent had retracted like a man in a patch of sneezeweed. Friends like to joke that he was most likely to secede. Bill Tuck's solution to the potential strike at VEPCO was to conscript all of the employees of VEPCO into the state militia and then threaten them with a court-martial if they failed to show up for work. It was a bold move, but it worked. The strike did not happen, and Tuck followed it up the next year with passing the so-called right to work law, which forever undermined the power of unions in Virginia. So this was a time when there was really no Republican opposition to speak of. So the real significant opposition came from inside the Democratic Party. After World War II, the opposition came from a group of youthful World War II veterans known as the Young Turks. It was a group led by a delegate from right here in Northern Virginia, someone you may have heard of, Armistead Booth. So Booth led this group known as the Young Turks. That's them on the bottom, all the Young Turks there. This was a group that was trying to get more money for public education and ditch the racist poll tax. They tried and failed several times before they were finally able to increase funding for schools. The Supreme Court eventually stepped in and got rid of the poll tax. So the legacy of the Young Turks ended up being an important turning point in the history of the Byrd machine. And that brings us to this: massive resistance. This is Moton High School in Farmville, where the beginning of the end started for the Byrd machine in the 1950s. It was a fire hazard with bad heating and a leaky roof. Water fountains were few and far between, and the auditorium was so small that any kind of assembly was overcrowded and stifling. The Prince Edward County School System promised to build a new school in 1946, but 5 years dragged on without any action or any funding. And so finally, the students had enough. They organized a walkout. Just before noon on Monday morning of April 1951, more than 450 students walked out of the school. They picketed and carried signs that read, "We want a new school or none at all. And we're tired of tar paper shacks." Members of the student council began canvassing the white citizens of Farmville about segregation, asking them if they really wanted to continue having separate and unequal school facilities. The Parent-Teacher Association called an emergency meeting where the NAACP argued that a new black high school would solve nothing. One student told the Associated Press, "We don't care if it takes 2 years. We plan to stay out until we get some kind of concrete information on the new school." Well, it took a lot more than 2 years. This was the lawsuit that's ended up sparking what's now known as the Brown versus Board decision. And the strike of the students went on for 2 weeks, a time when the school officials threatened disciplinary action against the students they considered to be playing hooky. The students may not have been getting a formal education during that time period, but they were certainly getting a crash course in constitutional law. By the time they returned to school, they had legal representation from the Richmond-based law firm of Hill, Martin, and Robinson. The lawyers sent a petition to the Prince Edward County School Board members demanding that they cease and desist segregating schools, warning that they were prepared to file a federal lawsuit if they didn't get a satisfactory answer. The school board voted to reject the petition and retain the services of their own firm, the Richmond-based Hunton, Williams, and Anderson. The students responded by filing a lawsuit in federal court, asking that the court restrain Prince William schools from enforcing the provision of the state constitution requiring segregated schools. And then in May 1951, 100 students and their parents filed a 22-page complaint arguing that they were suffering irreparable injury and are threatened with irreparable injury into the future. So one of the most prominent students leading this charge was Barbara Johns. So she had a connection with Martin Luther King, like a family connection that sort of helped her rally the other students. So she brought kind of star power, but it didn't necessarily give them top billing in the legal case. So the lawsuit here in Virginia was Davis et al. Versus the County Board of Prince William County, but you probably know it as Brown versus Board because that's what got the top billing. But so the story of massive resistance does not end well for the Byrd machine. In fact, the machine never really recovers from this racist fiasco. The beginning of the end was when Governor Lindsey Almond went on radio and television to deliver a blistering speech that left no doubt in anybody's mind that he would do whatever was necessary to continue unyielding resistance of race mixing in Virginia's public schools. He also managed to mix in some culture war rhetoric that actually might be familiar today. So this is what he said in his infamous speech, quote, "To those who defend or close their eyes to the livid stench of sadism, sex, immorality, and juvenile pregnancy infesting the mixed schools of the District of Columbia and elsewhere, let me make it abundantly clear for the record, now and hereafter, as governor of this state, I will not yield to that which I know to be wrong and will destroy every rational semblance of education for thousands of children in Virginia." One hell of a speech, really. Many people assumed that he wouldn't be saying these things unless he had a plan to prevent integration, when in fact he did not. 8 days later, he appeared before a joint session of the General Assembly and admitted that all he could do was minimize race mixing in the schools. Richmond Times-Dispatch editor Virginia Stabney responded this way, quote, "The massive resistors were thunderstruck," adding Almond was sneeringly referred to by some thereafter as Benedict Almond. The era of massive resistance ended right here in Arlington, very close to where we are right now, at 8:45 a.m., February 2nd, 1959, where 4 Black students entered Stratford Junior High and Cherrydale. 15 minutes later, 17 Black students enrolled in 6 Norfolk schools. So tensions were high in both places, and both schools had heavy police presence that day. But there were no pickets, no mobs, and no violence. So unlike other southern states where integration became an ugly spectacle, the scene here in Arlington and also playing out that same day in Norfolk was calm and peaceful. Significant to Arlington, though, because it was the first place, actually, to have an integrated schools, ending massive resistance. So that brings us to this guy, Linwood Holton. He broke the Byrd machine. His election as a Republican in 1969 represented the end of a long line of governors who were hand-selected by the Byrd machine to perpetuate the existence of the political machine. So it's important to remember that his campaign in 1969 that broke the back of the Byrd machine, that was not his first campaign for governor. It was actually his second campaign for governor. He also ran an unsuccessful campaign for governor in 1965, the previous election cycle, which was the final election where the Byrd machine candidate was able to win. So this election in 1965, not the 69 election, the 65 election, was a real doozy. And I've got an entire chapter in my book devoted to just this one political campaign because how crazy it was. So the Byrd machine candidate was Mills Godwin. He won. Linwood Holton was the Republican candidate. He lost. But there were 2 more candidates. One was this guy, William Story of the Conservative Party. So he was inspired by the John Birch Society. So if you know anything about the John Birch Society, that's all of what he was doing. Then there was another candidate in the race, a candidate from right here in Arlington, your claim to fame, the Nazi leader, George Lincoln Rockwell. So congratulations, Arlington. Your main contribution to this book is supplying the Nazi who challenged the Byrd machine in 1965. So what is the legacy of the Byrd machine? I'm going to wrap it up now and take your questions. What is the legacy of the Byrd machine? Well, it's changing. This portrait of Harry Byrd was once prominently placed right outside of the Senate chamber. That's the Senate chamber there in the background. This portrait has been removed. It's no longer there. There used to be a statue of Harry Byrd in Capitol Square. It's also been removed. It's not there. Just recently removed. So, you know, we are in some ways fighting with the legacy of the Byrd machine even today, but we still have a lot of these legacy aspects of it. For example, the short ballot. I mentioned earlier, Virginia is rare among states. There's only 3 statewide elected officials in Virginia, the governor, the lieutenant governor, and the attorney general. That's a legacy of the Byrd machine. That's Harry Byrd's short ballot is still with us today. We don't elect the person who oversees our elections, the governor of it. So we don't elect any of the cabinet officials. The governor appoints those people, right? So the Virginia actually has the most powerful governor in the country, basically because of Harry Byrd. That's a legacy that we still live with. Like this zombie system that he created is still with us. The outsized influence of the governor, that is still with us. Underfunded schools. Even today, our schools in Virginia are not funded to an extent they are in other states. That actually is an ongoing legacy of the Byrd machine. Low turnout voter elections. Up until very recently, it was actually pretty hard to vote in Virginia compared to other states. That's a legacy of the Byrd machine that was only recently undermined. That's basically it for my formal comments. I wanted to also point out that I've got a couple other books. Wicked Northern Virginia has a chapter about your famous local Nazi here, George Lincoln Rockwell. What a guy. Also, Shotgun Justice is about a Arlington prosecutor who closed casinos and brothels, and quite a guy. I believe this shotgun on the cover of the book is now in the possession of the Arlington Historical Society, and you can actually go visit the shotgun. It's quite a piece. But so that's all for my formal comments. But I love taking questions, and I understand we're going to go back and forth here between the audience and Zoom. I'm not exactly sure how that's going to work, but I'll start with the audience. Do I see any hands of anyone that wants to ask a question? Yes, sir.
Did Byrd have to get the governor to be elected by more than one term?
Okay, so the question was, did Byrd attempt to have the governor be elected for more than one term? No, the answer to that is no. So like Virginia is the only state in the country that has this one-term governor. So you can come back. Mills Godwin actually famously came back for a second term, but you can't have a second consecutive term. That dates way back before the Byrd machine. That's the origin of that has nothing to do with the Byrd machine. And he made no effort to change it when he was changing around the Constitution. So that was something that predated Byrd, and he made no attempts to change it. But it does also increase the importance of the election of the governor, right? I mean, like a lot of the Byrd machine was solely focused at who becomes the next governor, and you know, organizing the machine around making sure that person became governor using the power of patronage and electioneering. So this is all mainly the most important thing to the Byrd machine is who is the next governor. Let's pick him and let's make him governor. Yes.
Yeah, well, doesn't Harry Flood Byrd have a son who served in the U.S. Senate? Does he figure in the Byrd machine at all?
So one of the things that could, I'm sorry, thank you so much. The question was, doesn't Harry Byrd have a son who served in the Senate? In fact, he took his seat, Harry Byrd Jr. Okay, so this is something about my book that might be a little bit controversial. I end my discussion of the Byrd machine in the late 60s with the death of Harry Byrd in 1966 and the election of a Republican governor in 1969. In my mind, the Byrd machine is over. Harry Byrd's son, Harry Byrd Jr., does become a United States Senator, and you could argue that the Byrd machine continued into those years, and that's a great argument. I would entertain that argument, but in my mind, the Byrd machine ends with the death of Harry Byrd and the election of the Republican governor. So Harry Byrd Jr. does spend a lot of time in the United States Senate. Do you consider that part of the Byrd machine era or not? I don't, but I would be willing to entertain that as a proposition. Any other questions from the audience? Yes, in the back.
I guess what Young Byrd serving in the Senate, I guess I'm trying to press a little hand question. If they try to use federal largesse, you know, the New Deal or whatever, to try to, fund things in Virginia.
So the question was, did the Byrd machine use the federal largesse of the New Deal in order to help their machine? The answer is no. Harry Byrd hated the New Deal. I mean, he hated Roosevelt. I mean, if you think about the mentality of big government, New Deal people using government for radical things, this is exactly the opposite of what Harry Byrd, his conservative political mindset. He didn't like debt spending. He didn't like the New Deal. He liked to frame himself as an early supporter of the New Deal that fell out with Roosevelt. I don't know that I buy that really. He did kind of briefly run for president in 1932, the year that Franklin Roosevelt got elected. As a matter of fact, on the cover of the book, in the upper left-hand corner, you see people holding signs there. The signs say Harry Byrd for president. And that was the convention in 1932. And so he kind of ran against Roosevelt in a way, and it ended up opposing the New Deal and opposing Franklin Roosevelt for many, many years. So yeah, they were kind of at polar opposites of that spectrum.
We have a
Yes.
few questions from Zoom if you're ready for a couple from
I'm
the
definitely
Zoom
ready
room.
for Zoom. I'll tell you what, I'll take this one question, I'll come to Zoom, I promise.
Okay.
Liked your book, Michael. Thank you very much. Great read.
Okay, if you didn't hear that, he really liked the book and it was a great read. I just want to make sure.
There was one fellow that you left out, and that was Judge Howard Smith, who was a preacher of the Byrd machine. And he had a lot of influence on trying to stop the Civil Rights Act in 1964. And that sort of signaled the whole change nationwide.
Yes, Northern Virginia Congressman, Byrd Lieutenant, was chairman of the Rules Committee, very influential guy, part of the Byrd machine. Came up, remind me his name again? Howard Smith, thank you. He was the 8th Congressional District, yes. And this is the currently the Byrd seat. He came up through the ranks, he actually was, most people don't know this about Smith, Congressman Smith, is that he actually worked for the Alexandria Gazette as an ad salesman early in his career. He later was a judge in the Alexandria courthouse. So he actually was part of that courthouse ring in Alexandria. There was a portrait of him in one of the courtrooms today. So he's still around, his legacy is still around. Very influential guy, as Rules Committee chairman, opposed a lot of the civil rights legislation. And yes, you are correct. I probably should have written more about him because his significance in the Byrd machine. But all right, but I promised Zoom I would take your questions. So
Okay, I got some Zoom questions for you. Here's the first one. Question from Tom. What was Byrd's or the Byrd's machine role in Arlington's adoption of its at-large system for electing members of its county board?
before we started, I was chatting about this very topic and kicking myself. I did not know more about this. So in what my previous book, Shotgun Justice, which happens in a distant past, when I was researching that, I came across lots of references to the Arlington County Board of Supervisors. And I came across several maps that had magisterial districts in Arlington. And so I said, well, what's this? We don't have this now. So yeah, at a certain point, Arlington got rid of the Board of Supervisors, got rid of the magisterial districts, and created the system that you've got now that has the countywide at-large seats. So no Board of Supervisors, no magisterial districts. When did that happen? And what, if anything, was the relationship with the Byrd machine is a great question, Zoom, but I don't know the answer to it. So I'm sorry. Any other questions?
Another question. What is the status of changing the name of the Harry Flood Byrd Highway due to his racist political positions? So,
you know, I mentioned that there's this portrait of Harry Byrd that used to be in the Capitol building right outside the Senate chamber that's gone. The statue of Harry Byrd that was in Capitol Square, also gone. There's the Harry Byrd Welcome Center on the Blue Ridge Parkway. That has been renamed. They've taken his name on that. Changing the name of roads can be difficult because these guys in the General Assembly sometimes need to get involved in it. They can agree on the budget or SCC judges or much of anything, really. So I think that's kind of part of the problem is that lawmakers would have to vote on it. But that's coming. I can almost guarantee you that it's things that are named for Harry Byrd right now probably won't be named that way 10 years from now.
All right, here's another one. Is it true that Harry Byrd is buried in Columbia Gardens off Route 50? If so, why in Arlington?
That's a stumper. Wow, gosh, I don't know the answer to that.
West Virginia.
Oh, that's a different, so I'm getting from the audience that that's a different Byrd. That's Robert Byrd, the West Virginia senator, which is actually no relation to the Byrds that we're talking about.
Okay,
Still a good
so we don't
question.
know. All right. And then can you comment on the impact of, I gotta scroll down for this one. Hold on just a second. Can you comment on the impact of urban suburban population growth and reapportionment, one man, one vote, as eroding the courthouse system of the rural counties?
Yeah, okay, so this is probably a more complicated answer because at the end of the Byrd machine, they had something called multi-member districts, and some people in this room might remember multi-member districts. I was recently chatting with Ken Plum, who's retiring, and I was asking him about his career. So he was first elected to the House of Delegates in the late 70s and likes to see himself as someone who began his career in politics fighting the Byrd machine. And in his mind, one of the main reasons in the 1970s that the Byrd machine was still around is these stupid multi-member districts. So it's like, it was a huge swath of Northern Virginia and it had 5 delegates. So you didn't get elected to your district, you got elected to a huge, massive district that had 5 members. So you had to raise a ton of money and beat a lot of people in order to be part of this multi-member district. All right, so the courts later determined that this was unconstitutional. They got rid of it. And so, you know, Ken Plum, again, first elected in the late 1970s, viewed that as a vestige of the Byrd machine that he wanted to get rid of. by advocating for merit selection of judges. Merit, so not anybody could be a judge. And in fact, in the Byrd machine, you often heard people who did not have, forget about being a lawyer, people who didn't have a college degree becoming a judge. People who might not have graduated high school were put in judge positions because the judges were so important. You wanted your person, you wanted your functionary to be a judge. And so you had a lot of selection of judges based on loyalty rather than what they would do as judge. And so that's a long way of answering your question. But yeah, the legacy, in some ways, the legacy of the Byrd machine was around for a very long time. And the urban-rural thing is really important too. The real power, the source of power was rural Virginia. It was not urban Virginia. And so that's the power base was the Shenandoah Valley, the South Side, you know, the rural farmland of Virginia, not the urban centers. And so, yeah, that was, and that divide clearly is still with us today in many ways, right?
So that's it for Zoom, but somebody did chime in and found that Harry Byrd Sr. and Jr. are buried in Winchester, Virginia.
Winchester, of course they're buried in Winchester. Yeah, now I'm going to go back to questions from the room. Yes. I think he dropped out of high school. I'm not sure that he finished high school. Like he became a member of the Winchester City Council as a very young man, and was very involved in the newspaper business, like making sure the newspaper survived. And I would have to double check this, but I'm pretty sure that I remember reading he never graduated high school because he got so involved in the newspaper business.
When did Virginia settle the Civil War debt?
Oh, slowly over a long period of time. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. The first question, remember the first question? Yeah, all right. The next question was, when did Virginia finally solve that Civil War debt? And it was done over a long period of time. So I don't know that there would be a place that I can think of off the top of my head where you pinpoint it, because the readjusters, the whole point of the readjusters was, let's not pay the debt, let's readjust it, right? So because if you actually paid it off, you would not be able to finance public education. You would not be able to finance all these progressive reforms that they wanted to do for asylums, right? So they wanted to spend that money. They didn't want to send it off to bankers, you know, in other states. And so that was the whole point of readjusting the debt. So when the conservative blue blood Bourbon Democrats came back into power, they were interested in actually paying it off and did eventually do that. So I don't know the year off the top of my head. I would say sometime late 1800s. Wait, another question over here.
Did you want to talk about his brother?
You know, I don't. So the question was about the brothers. There are three brothers: Tom, Dick, and Harry, and that actually is where we get the expression Tom, Dick, and Harry. It's actually the Byrd brothers. One of them is a famous admiral who circumnavigated the globe and went to the Antarctica. And yeah, I mean, his brothers had kind of a fame in their own right. As a matter of fact, if you look at so one of the things I'm doing as a researcher, I'm looking through all these old newspapers and I'm doing all my keyword searches. And here comes Admiral Byrd all the time. I'm not interested in Admiral Byrd. Give me to Senator Byrd. But yes, very famous brothers in their own right for doing all kinds of things. But I don't really touch on them too much in the book. Yes.
Can you speak about his relationships with other national Democrats following FDR, namely Truman, Kennedy, and Johnson, with whom he was very much out of step?
That's a great question. Okay, so for the Zoom audience, what was his relationship with other Democrats after the New Deal Roosevelt types? So we talked about his antipathy toward Roosevelt and the New Deal. What happened to his relationship with the Democratic Party after that? He hated them, couldn't stand them, didn't like Truman, didn't like Johnson. He hated the Great Society, the Johnson, all the Byrd machine, hated all that sort of stuff, right? And in fact, one of the really interesting things about the 1965 campaign for governor that I was talking about earlier is that something cracked, and the Byrd machine candidate for governor, Mills Godwin, got on board the Lady Bird Express, the train, the campaign train that was run by the Johnson campaign that had Lady Bird Johnson on a train, and it came through Virginia. And here's the Byrd machine candidate for governor on the Johnson campaign train. And they actually had an event at Union Station in Alexandria. And so that was a real turning point, because you could tell things were about to fall apart because the Byrd machine was having an alliance with the Johnson campaign. That was weird. And then you also had like Armistead Booth was campaigning with Mills Godwin here in Arlington, right? So they had a really weird coalition, as it turns out, a very successful coalition that included the union people were supporting the Byrd machine candidate. This is why you know things are upside down and something was about to happen. That's why the 1965 campaign is so interesting. But that's a long way of answering your question. The answer is Byrd machine could not stand the Democratic Party, didn't like them, and famously had something called the golden silences. The golden silence is, I'm not going to tell you how I'm going to vote. Like, do you endorse President Johnson? No, I'm going to have to be silent on President Johnson, and you make up your own mind as a voter. So yeah, like the golden silence indicated an opposition, an unspoken opposition that was very important to the Byrd machine and their philosophy. Yes. Why would they support? Because they didn't like the other candidate. So the question was, why would the unions support the Byrd machine candidate? So after what I just went over, the interesting history here of how the Byrd machine crushed the power of unions to the extent that even today, unions do not have the power. That's a legacy of the Byrd machine. Why on earth would the unions support Mills Godwin, the Byrd machine candidate for governor? The short answer is they didn't like the other candidates. They also liked the fact Mills Godwin got on the Lady Bird Express. Yeah, I mean, it was a shrewd move on Mills Godwin's part to campaign with Johnson because he picked up the union support, which he would not have otherwise. Other questions? Yes. Okay.
The chat line where the Byrd organization would announce their candidates. Did he start that? How did it get to be a Byrd organization function?
Yeah, well, those were kind of events. I'm sorry, the question, yes, the shad planking and where did that come from? Sort of what's the Byrd machine legacy? With shad planking is an annual event. It's like a picnic, right? Byrd had an annual picnic. It was a really big deal for a very long period of time. And it was like fried chicken and apples and, politicking. And I mean, that was just kind of almost how things were done necessarily. I mean, like you get people together and you press the flesh, and probably the reason you're in this room right now, Delegate Sickles, to see your constituents and campaign a little bit. And so, yeah, that was the point of the shad planking, is to press the flesh and get the votes that you need to win your election. So yeah, I mean, that's just kind of tried and true.
Didn't they use the event as a chance to pronounce who the next governor was going to be?
Didn't they use the event to pronounce the selection for who the governor was going to be? Well, the selection of governor would sort of evolved over time. And oftentimes those kinds of events were sizing people up to figure out sort of where they were and if they had what it took to be the Byrd machine candidate. So that's another reason why they were important face-to-face time to figure out, is he going to be our guy or not? And those were all really important things. Like those kinds of events played a very important role in all of the people. I mean, it was Byrd's opinion was obviously paramount, but he had a bunch of lieutenants too. Like it really mattered what Bill Tuck was the governor I talked about. He went on to be in Congress. So he was part of the Byrd machine for a very long time. His opinion also was very important, as were, like Lindsey Allman, people like that. Like all of these people kind of gravitated to pick the guy, right? And all of that's very important. We have more questions. Yes.
Do we recognize your voice originating from Richmond when we listen to public radio?
The question is about NPR. If you're an NPR listener, you might recognize my voice. Also, I have a podcast. I have one of the podcast listeners over here at Pod Virginia. Yes, I do appear on National Public Radio when I can. Yes.
So you close it.
Do my closing. I'll do it as a closing.
And I have a comment, one more from the Zoom too, when you get a chance.
Okay, I have one question, I'll come back to Zoom.
You mentioned Claude Swanson, we have a middle school named Swanson.
He was part of the Martin machine, yeah.
Yeah, so any more on what his role in later?
Well, he actually also appears in Shotgun Justice because the Martin machine, the Commonwealth's attorney at the center of this book was kind of a progressive reformer who was fighting against what kind of became the Martin machine. Claude Swanson was part of the Martin machine. And he was the candidate who won in that first post-Jim Crow election. So the 1901 election is pre-Jim Crow Constitution. That's the guy, Montague. And then they had this constitution where they sort of ripped out a third of the voters, or a third to half of the voters. And then, so you have this radically transformed electorate where there were far fewer voters. The machine takes over, and who gets elected governor? Claude Swanson. Claude Swanson is the first of the Martin machine governors. So, I mean, that's his place in the pantheon. And then later he is appointed by Roosevelt to become Secretary of the Navy, and he opens up a Senate seat that Harry Byrd is appointed to. So he actually plays an important role in Harry Byrd showing up in Washington. Any other? Yes.
From the Byrd machine in centralizing power in the governor. I mean, I'm assuming it must be legislatively granted to him, or how does he derive this power to make all these patron appointments?
So the question was, has there been any movement to take power away from the governor? So the governor has the power to appoint all these cabinet positions, and voters do not elect the cabinet positions. The governor appoints them. And in order to make any changes to that system, you'd have to have a new constitution. So Virginia would have to have a constitutional convention, which, by the way, happens from time to time. Like our current constitution was written in the 1970s, and the guy who is the main guy who wrote it is still around. He's a professor at UVA. I've interviewed him several times. So it's not like, Virginia could have another constitution. They could have another convention. They could have another constitution. As a matter of fact, that 1970s constitution, I can tell you from talking to the people who put it together, was largely envisioned as a anti-Jim Crow constitution. They were trying to undo a lot of the influence of the Byrd machine. One thing they did not touch was the short ballot and electing some of those other cabinet positions. But who knows, in the next however many years, we might have another constitution and rethink that system. All right, did you say we have another Zoom question?
I just had a comment. Somebody in the Zoom said, Senator Charlie Fenwick lived over on Underwood Street, was part of the Byrd organization till about 65 or 66, when he began to break some from the organization. You can Google Senator Charles Fenwick and see his history. The Fenwick House I believe, is still on the corner of Underwood and Lee Highway.
Yeah, breaking.
Just a little Arlington trivia.
Yeah. Yeah, breaking from the machine was not good. You were a loyal person, or you were out of the machine, right? Yeah. Did I see another hand over here? Yes.
Does Virginia has a one-term governor with it, or executive term? Does that predate the Byrd machine or the Martin machine?
It does, yeah.
A result of the Byrd.
No, so Virginia is the only state in the country that has that one-term limit, 4 years and you're out. That actually predates the Byrd machine. It's around, goes back way back to, I mean, actually that kind of dates back to colonial era distrust of executive authority. And there was a time when other states had that. Several other states had that. They've all gotten rid of their one-term limit. Virginia, for whatever reason, has kept it all these years. Yes.
And Arlington, in the 1930s, I moved here in 91, so very good. Did the Byrd machine have any effect on Arlington's decision to have a city manager form of government unique to the Commonwealth?
Yeah, so the question is about the organization of Arlington's government, which is unique, I think would be the word that I would use to describe it. I mean, like, there is no other local government in Virginia that has a system anywhere like the one that Arlington has. And so, yeah, I actually don't know the answer to that. The transition from the Arlington Board of Supervisors to the current Arlington County Board may or may not have had anything to do with the Byrd machine. Actually, I don't know the answer.
1932.
1932.
Yeah.
Okay. That would have been kind of the era that's right before, that's actually after, well, that's right as Byrd is gaining power. So that actually, I would doubt it. I actually would doubt it based on that date.
I have another
Yes.
bit of trivia from the Zoom room. I know we're running out of time. Can I share this okay?
Sure, yeah.
So, let's see. It's yesterday I had a nice chat with my family friend Barbara Ball Savage. Her father, Frank Ball Sr., was a seatmate of Harry Byrd in the Virginia State Senate. Senator Ball was anti-Byrd Democrat, but got along personally with members of the machine. Maria Shreve, which was the wife of Senator Ball, was appalled at the manner in which workers were treated at orchards owned by Senator Byrd. So that's a little, because Ball is a big name in Arlington. So that's another
I
bit.
actually wrote about Senator Ball extensively in Shopkin Justice. Actually, he plays a
Okay, great.
separate
And
book.
thank you, because I know we're running out of time, but I wanted to share that, and thank you.
Thank you.